All right, well, let's get started. Welcome to today's risk reduction class, where we're going to talk about dealing with specific situations in today's market relative to preparing buyer offers and things that sellers might be aware of in receiving offers. It is an unusual market, to say the least, with a lot of crazy offers being written. And so I wanted to take an opportunity to review a few things about writing offers in today's market that, if you're not careful, could either, one, get you in trouble, or two, fail to have the impact that you meant it to have because perhaps your clauses weren't written as well as they could have been. So any questions at all, especially if some of the material today you're confronted with right now and want a little guidance, a little help. Some of these slides, it'll be difficult to take notes fast enough, perhaps, as I try to get through this in an hour. I don't want to run long at all. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. And again, these suggested addendums will be available to you on Agent Hub and available to RE/MAX All Pro as well. Okay, so handling offers in today's crazy real estate market, and it is crazy. I have heard of stories of some agents, one agent in particular, getting over 70 offers on one listing. I don't know how an agent can handle that, but she did. And offers of over $125,000 over the list price, and the list price was at the high end of the comps. So it is just crazy out there. I don't go to Facebook too much. It's a generational thing, I think. But I was looking at it just the other day, in fact, this weekend, actually. And I won't embarrass him, but Jim Supples shared a post that, if you didn't see it, well, perhaps this will give you a little insight on today's market. Now, think of today's real estate as a game of musical chairs. In a buyer's market, you've got 10 chairs and only 5 people playing, right? Plenty of properties and not a whole lot of buyers. So that means it's a buyer's market, of course. In a seller's market, it's kind of the reverse. You only got 6 chairs and 8 people playing, so there's a bit of competition. Prices tend to be upward pressure on prices. In the current market, you've got 3 chairs, 40 people playing. The chairs are on fire, and you're being chased around the room by a scary clown. So that kind of sums up the market we're in today. So let's take a look at some of the things that agents are doing. I'm not necessarily advocating any of these, but if you need to do these things to get your offer accepted, and you've reviewed the risks with the buyer, then it's not our place to judge whether a buyer can make what some people might say is pretty risky offers, if you will. I'm going to talk about paying over list price, about the appraisal contingency, about the loan contingency, the investigation contingency, and finally, and then the escalation clause, and then finally wrap it up with a review of a form already available to you in CAR, zip forms, that contains a pretty good outline of advisory that a buyer should consider as they look at these various aspects. Okay, so the first thing, paying over list price. That's probably the simplest thing. You just simply determine a number you're going to pay. When I was selling real estate, we frequently went up, $500 to $1,000 over list price, and that sort of ensured you win the day. Today's market's quite a bit different than that. So the buyer makes a decision to pay whatever the buyer is willing to pay. And it's pretty straightforward. You put that number down on your offer, and that's the price. When a buyer wants to pay over list, or more importantly, over what the comps show, because most buyers' agents are going to review the comps with the buyer prior to writing the offer, it's important to advise the buyer of some of the risks that go along with that. You know, the obvious benefit is you perhaps will win that particular house, you'll get your offer accepted, but there are some risks associated with that, and we'll cover that in detail at the end of the presentation. So paying over list price is pretty straightforward. Not so much the appraisal contingency and paying over appraisal. A lot of agents are writing clauses that are misinterpreted, and in some cases actually can get either the buyer or the seller in trouble and have unintended consequences. So I want to look at basically 4 ways to deal with the appraisal contingency, with a focus on the last 2 in all probability. The first is simply removing the appraisal contingency. The second way is to remove the appraisal contingency and agree to pay whatever the purchase price is outright. A third way is to lower the appraisal contingency threshold. So you'll still buy the property even if the appraisal doesn't reach the offered price. We'll talk a little bit about how that can work. And then finally, agreeing to pay up to so many dollars over the appraisal, but not more than the purchase price. The last 2, 3, and 4 are probably the most common and best ways to approach the appraisal contingency when you're writing offers that are probably above comps and may cause a challenge to getting it to come in appraised at the purchase price. So let's look at 1 through 4 specifically. So the appraisal contingency and removal clause is in the RPA. It's paragraph 3I. That's an I, not a 1. So paragraph 3I contains the appraisal contingency and when it'll be removed. And that's typically in maybe a different market, a more normal market. You wait for your appraisal to come in, and if it appraises, you remove the contingency. And if it doesn't, you negotiate perhaps an adjustment to the price, or the buyer agrees to bring in more money. So simply removing the appraisal contingency is pretty straightforward. You go to paragraph 3I and simply check the box. This agreement is not contingent upon a written appraisal. Now, one could argue that means you're going to pay the purchase price, but there's not an affirmative statement that the buyer is willing to do that. So you have a little less assurance that the buyer is going to, in fact, pay over the appraisal. If all you do is simply do situation number 1, removing the appraisal contingency, there may be some concern as to what the buyer will ultimately pay or be willing to pay when the appraisal comes in low. So removing the appraisal contingency and agreeing to pay the purchase price outright. So again, you remove the appraisal contingency, but you should also include the following in an addendum. Now, this is agreeing to pay whatever purchase price you offered, regardless of whether it appraises or not. So if that's the case and you advise the buyer of that risks involved in that, then you would prepare an addendum after modifying paragraph 3I, as I just showed you. Then you would prepare an addendum which would include a couple of clauses. The first is this agreement is not contingent upon an appraisal of the property. Buyer shall proceed with the purchase at the stated purchase price without regard to an appraisal valuation of the property. And then the second clause, in the event the buyer is financing all or part of the purchase price, the buyer shall make up the difference between the amount financed and the purchase price in cash at closing. Now, be very careful with, the language I'm suggesting. I'm not necessarily suggesting this is what you do, I am suggesting this is what you do when the buyer wants to do what we're talking about. Hope that distinction is well made. I'm not advocating, disregarding the appraisal. I think it's kind of risky, in fact, personally, but then maybe I'm kind of a low risk guy. But if you are going to fool around with the appraisal, you want to be careful with your language. I'll give you an example. Buyer will agree to pay over appraisal is not an enforceable clause. Legally, you can't enforce that. That is a statement of a future intent of the buyer. It is not an obligation of the buyer. The key word is shall. Will is kind of a dangerous word. It often doesn't get you in trouble, but in things like this, where a buyer suddenly doesn't want to pay over appraisal after he said he will, you're not going to enforce that because of the word will, or but if you have the word shall, at least you have something that is more binding. So again, repeating myself, be careful of the language. That's why I went to the trouble of putting together several different clauses that are a little more enforceable, a little clearer. Should an adjudicator get involved, the intent is very clear. All right. So lowering the appraisal contingency threshold. This is a very simple way of dealing with the appraisal. This is actually Carr's recommended approach to dealing with the appraisal. So you start with the appraisal contingency. You do not check the box that it's not contingent upon an appraisal, because it is. However, on an addendum, you modify the appraisal contingency as such. This is actually the addendum language, this entire paragraph. It should be written, it'll read, the first sentence of paragraph 3I shall be modified as follows. This agreement is contingent upon a written appraisal of the property by a licensed or certified appraiser at no less than X dollars below the purchase price. So if the buyer was willing to move ahead, if it appraised within $10,000 of the purchase price, then as long as it appraises at 10,000 or above below the purchase price, in other words, appraises at 9,000 below the purchase price, 8,000 below, 7,000 below, then the appraisal contingency goes away. And by assumption, the buyer is willing to pay that difference because he doesn't have a ability to cancel, because it only came in 7,000 low, 7,000 below the purchase price. And he said, or she said, maybe they put in 10,000. However, if it appraised at 11,000 below the purchase price, the appraisal contingency would still exist. So the buyer would not be stuck paying 11,000. He'd only be paying 10,000. So that is one way to approach the appraisal contingency. It's a fairly simple, straightforward way. Now, a more detailed approach, kind of following item 3, but being a little more specific, is the following. You're agreeing to pay up to X number of dollars over the appraisal price, but not more than the purchase price. And so on an addendum, you modify the appraisal contingency as follows. You do, repeat that one clause from the earlier situation. Again, the clause is the first sentence of paragraph 3I shall be modified as follows. The agreement is contingent upon a written appraisal of the property by a licensed or certified appraiser at no less than, and this is the amount you're willing to pay over appraisal. So if you're willing to pay $25,000 over appraisal, you would put $25,000 in that blank. You go on to sort of bind the fact that the buyer will move ahead as long as it appraises not less than $25,000 below the purchase price, or $10,000 below the purchase price, or whatever number you put in this blank. So paragraph 2 of the addendum, in the event the appraisal comes below the purchase price, buyer shall pay up to X number of dollars over the appraisal, but not more than the purchase price. And then again, you would repeat that same number as from paragraph 1. And then finally, in the event the buyer is financing all or part of the purchase price, buyer shall make up the difference between the amount financed and the purchase price in cash. So those 3 clauses on an addendum, it makes it pretty clear what the buyer's intent is. It makes it pretty clear what the buyer can be held to, otherwise the deposit is at risk, and at the same time gives the buyer a certain amount of protection when the appraisal is way below what the buyer was willing to pay, and now the buyer, cannot make up that cash difference or is unwilling to make up that cash difference. Now, a comment that I'll make is not on a slide here. I just want to share this with everyone. As a listing agent, if a buyer is willing to pay over appraisal by X number of dollars, when you look at the verification of funds, it's got to include not only the down payment, not only the closing costs, but that additional amount of money. Recently, I was involved in a situation, it was a pretty easy problem to resolve, but unfortunately it was resolved in a negative way. The buyer did not have the additional funds to pay the difference between what it appraised and what the loan amount was. The buyer simply had the funds for the down payment and the closing costs. And this was discovered, 2-3 weeks into the escrow. And of course, the buyer took the position, I don't have the money, and ultimately did wiggle out because the appraisal contingency clauses weren't written that well anyway. Had the listing agent simply confirmed that the buyer had that cash at the beginning with the verification of funds, in this case, he would have found out the buyer didn't have it, and it would have alerted the listing agent and the seller that the buyer can't perform, can't do what the listing agent and the seller thought the buyer was going to do. So it's very important to add to your confirmation of funds, your verification of funds, if you will, the dollar amount of the difference between the purchase price and what the buyer is saying they'll make up on a short appraisal. Okay, now if you have any questions, interrupt me. This is the kind of class where there might be a lot of questions, and we get into another topic, going back to this appraisal will be a little confusing. So
I have a question, Walt.
Yes.
So if a seller agrees to that, I thought that what if the appraisal came in very low and it came in, $50,000 under the purchase price, and the buyer only agreed to pay an extra $20,000? Is the seller then obligated to take that lower price?
No, that's a great question, by the way. I thought about it and I decided not to, because I didn't want to sort of put on the screen a bunch of bad clauses and then confuse people. There's nothing in these clauses that obligates the seller to sell the property for the appraised amount. What is the person being obligated is the buyer, but he's only being obligated as much as he's willing to obligate himself. So if the buyer was willing to pay $10,000 over appraisal and the price came down, appraisal came in $15,000 low, the seller does not have to lower the price $5,000. He might want to, but he doesn't have to. None of the clauses that I've reviewed here bind the buyer to sell the property at an appraised price or some price below the list price to get closer, the purchase price rather, to get closer to the appraisal amount. Again, as a practical matter, the seller might agree to doing that. So, because if the appraisal comes in significantly low, that problem is not going to go away with the next offer in all probability. Does that answer your question, Vicki?
Yeah, but I thought that we had talked about that before, that would obligate the seller if they agree to pay just a certain amount above the appraised value, that I thought then that was binding the seller as well. So you're saying it is not.
Well, there's nowhere in these clauses that says the seller will lower the price. In all these clauses but there have been clauses, I don't remember specifically the conversation you and I had, but I have seen a lot of clauses. Car Legal does have a few clauses on their website of clauses not to write. Don't write this, don't write that. Where the seller, the implication would be the seller has agreed to lower the price of the appraisal. Purchase price shall be, up to $25,000 above appraisal. Well, if it appraises $35,000 below what they thought the purchase price was, guess what? That seller now agreed to come down $10,000.
Okay, that's exactly what it was. Okay, so we have to be real careful with the verbiage when you're representing a seller. Okay.
Well, don't use any other verbiage than what I'm suggesting in these slides. That's why I'm going to make this verbiage available to you in the next day or so you can actually, cut and paste it right onto an addendum. These clauses do not bind the seller to lower the price. It does bind the buyer to proceed under certain circumstances, but in some cases, not case number 2, where the seller agrees, regardless of appraisal, to pay purchase price. It gives in items 1 and 3 and 4 gives the buyer some protection from a very low appraisal relative to purchase price.
Okay.
Is that clear to everyone? I hope that none of these clauses bind the seller. Okay. Now, the appraisal contingency and mandatory clause. This is important. A lot of times agents won't think about this, and there's a lot of misinformation about the mandatory clause. And even online one time, again, I don't know why I was looking, but I was looking at some online website, some Facebook, I think it was through Facebook group that I guess I'm a member of, and they had a long discussion about the amendatory clause, and it was clear to me that many of the people commenting didn't really understand the amendatory clause. So I want to review that with you and how it affects an appraisal. Okay. So in the RPA under loans, the amendatory clause only comes into play when there's an FHA or VA financing. So if you are doing FHA and VA financing, it is imperative, and I already know I forgot to make a check, but it's imperative you check if it's VA or you check if it's FHA. We had a situation a year or so ago where the VA loan box was not checked. So then because the VA loan box was not checked and the buyer was trying to go for a VA loan, the mandatory clause, there was no requirement of the seller to sign it. Now, I sort of backed into this. If you have an FHA or VA loan, the boilerplate of the contract says that the amendatory clause shall be a part of this agreement. This is one of the big misunderstandings a lot of agents have. There is no law, either state, I don't know every state, I know California, no law in the state of California or civil law code that requires a seller to sign an amendatory clause with FHA VA financing. But as a practical matter, the seller kind of has to, because the buyer cannot get his VA or FHA loan unless an amendatory clause is part of the loan package. Why is that? Because FHA and VA will not insure loans that do not include an amendatory clause as part of the package. So when the lender packages a loan up 3 or 4 days after funding, and now they want to sell this loan with all the other loans they funded, if they don't have an amendatory clause in a particular loan, the VA and FHA won't insure it, and the investors won't buy the loan. So the lenders require an amendatory clause to be signed, not civil code. So Carr wisely made it a boilerplate obligation of a seller if VA or FHA, and I forgot to check the FHA box, but if VA or FHA financing is part of the deal. Now, what is the mandatory clause? Everybody with me so far? Okay, so the mandatory clause, there's one in car, lenders have their own, but the language is pretty universally pretty similar. I mean, across the board. I've looked at a lot of them, very little deviation. So let's look at the car FHA VA mandatory clause and analyze that a little bit. Okay, so the first clause, paragraph 1, contains the important information about relative to what I'm talking about. Okay, notwithstanding any other provision in this contract. So the buyer, a VA buyer or an FHA buyer, waives his appraisal contingency when he writes his offer. Well, notwithstanding any other provision in this contract, in other words, it doesn't matter. The VA or FHA buyer agrees to pay $10,000 over appraisal, and it's in the contract. It doesn't matter, notwithstanding any other provision in this contract. The purchaser shall not be obligated to complete the purchase of the property or incur any penalty by forfeiture of earnest money deposit unless the purchaser has given, and I just simplified it here, a written statement, that's the appraisal, setting forth the appraised value of the property at not less than, and when you fill this out, if you're doing it as an agent, you want to write in the purchase price. If the lender provides you one, and usually lenders provide them, the lender is going to print the purchase price. So what does all that mean in total? It means it doesn't matter what else is in the contract. It doesn't matter. If there's an mandatory clause signed, an addendum signed, and the appraisal doesn't come in at least purchase price, the buyer, the FHA or VA buyer, cannot lose their deposit. It's as simple as that. So agreeing to pay over appraisal if you're an FHA or VA buyer has, little or no teeth in it because the deposit is not at risk. Everybody clear on that? Okay, that's important to keep that in mind. All right. So let's talk about the loan contingency and the removal of the loan contingency with the offer. That's pretty straightforward. Paragraph 3J lists the loan terms when the application and the loan contingency and the loan contingency removal or no loan contingency. Again, don't recommend this at all, but again, it's pretty straightforward. A buyer can buy a property. They're convinced they're going to get their loan. And I suppose Bill Gates wouldn't have any concern at all. He wants to borrow the money because he likes to stay liquid, but he's going to buy that house in La Jolla, and he's not the least bit concerned about a loan contingency because if I don't get my loan, Walt, I'll just pay cash. I'll take it out of petty cash, I suppose. So it is appropriate for certain people in certain financial situations to want to get a loan because that makes more sense to them, but they're not going to have a loan contingency because if they can't get a loan for one reason or the other, they'll just use cash to buy the property. Okay.
Hey, Walt.
Yes.
Well, can I, on that FHA VA addendum,
Yeah.
You might want to mention what happened with us on that Tidewater, that we were able to remove all contingencies and still hold the seller hostage until we got the Tidewater to come in, the new appraisal.
Right.
So
I don't remember specifically that particular problem, but yes, if on a VA or FHA buyer, if there's a mandatory clause signed, and of course the seller is obligated to sign it, it's in the boilerplate of the contract. If it doesn't appraise, you can't lose your deposit. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, we were just able to keep that. We were able to remove all contingencies, though, and still kind of hold that seller hostage till we got the appraisal in at the higher amount.
Right, because if the appraisal didn't come in, you had an escape clause, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
Okay.
Walt, I have a quick question on that same topic.
Yes.
If so, we have the mandatory clause. If an FHA buyer does have some funds to add in if the purchase, can they?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think you cut off last there, but yeah, there's nothing in the regulations by the lender or the federal government that prohibits an FHA buyer or VA buyer from making up the difference.
Okay.
So a buyer can make up the difference in cash, a VA buyer, if they choose to. It's just that they don't lose their deposit if they don't. Where we were discussing those other, those four different ways to approach an appraisal contingency. In some of those situations, the buyer's deposit could be at risk. With a VA, they're never at risk, but they're still allowed never at risk relative to the appraisal. They're still allowed to pay over appraisal if they choose to. Yeah, they can't finance.
Wait, Walt?
Yes.
So was that Ann who was just talking about the Tidewater? Because if that was, were they getting a second appraisal by the VA company, or was the appraisal being reviewed and they were coming in and they were going to do it again? The same person was going to do it again.
That was Brenda. And it was the Tidewater came in and we sent a rebuttal back and we won the rebuttal and got the $15,000 increase on the appraisal. It was the
Thanks,
lender,
Brenda.
the lender that did the rebuttal.
Oh, thanks, Brenda.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the investigation contingency. This is one that, they all concern me a bit. This one concerns me quite a bit because a lot of buyers apparently are buying property, waiving their investigation contingency, which is about as risky as it gets, I think. So let's talk a little bit about that. A buyer waiving an investigation contingency, including the physical inspection contingency. When the buyer waives his investigation contingency, it does not waive or reduce the seller's legal and contractual obligations to provide seller disclosures. So the seller is still obligated to make disclosures, but the buyer may have waived his contingencies nonetheless, but a buyer could then elect to forfeit their deposit and not buy the house because the disclosures were serious enough that they didn't want to move forward. However, they probably are pretty safe unless an agent understands about they being the buyer, removing contingencies and then getting a disclosure about the situation, a negative situation about the property. When you see these next few slides, to understand, why waiving investigation contingencies, it has to be structured correctly or it's sort of a moot point. What am I talking about? Well, first of all, I'm talking about statutory disclosures. Statutory disclosures are required by civil code unless a property is exempt. If a property is exempt from certain disclosures, certain statutory disclosures, then you don't have to provide it. But if it's not exempt, then there's no option not to provide them. You're supposed to provide them. Okay. Now, here's the important point. Statutory disclosures carry a 3 to 5 day right of rescission if they are a part of Civil Code 1102. 1102, the most famous disclosure in 1102 is the TDS. And interestingly enough, the HHDA is also in Civil Code 1102. So it works just like a TDS as far as having a 3 to 5 day right of rescission. 3 to 5 days. It's not like, pick one. It's 3 days if it's delivered in person to the buyer. So the seller would have to hand it to the buyer, not the buyer's agent, the buyer, which doesn't happen in real estate that involve agents. Listing agents don't have access to the buyer directly as a rule. So 5 days if delivered by mail or electronic mail. So in general, most people quote the 5 days right of rescission. Delivery and right of rescission, this is important, cannot be waived. It is unenforceable. So the buyer can write on the contract, I'm waiving my right to the TDS, and then he decides they don't want to buy the house, that waiving my right to the TDS is not enforceable. He is entitled to a TDS. And when he gets a TDS or she gets a TDS, she's got the 5-day right of rescission by statute. All right. So what are the statutory disclosures that contain this 5-day right of rescission and cannot be waived? Well, the transfer disclosure statement, including the agent's visual inspection. Now, in RE/MAX, both All Pro and United, we require the agent's visual inspection to be done not on the TDS, but on an AVID. It is important to note that AVID, you check the box on the TDS, the AVID now becomes part of the TDS. So if you deliver the TDS and you have not, and an agent has not, nobody at RE/MAX, All Pro, or United would do this, but if you're dealing with an agent who delivers a TDS to your buyer and they have not filled in the agent inspection on page 3, then the TDS has not been delivered. Or if they check the box, which even some of our agents sometimes do, they check the box AVID, but they don't do the AVID right away. Oh yeah, we'll provide that here as soon as I get over to the house. Well, guess what? The 5-day right of rescission hasn't started yet until the AVID gets delivered, because by checking the box in the TDS on page 3, you made the AVID part of the transfer disclosure statement. So there must be an agent visual inspection as a part of the transfer disclosure statement, and we do not allow agents to simply write on the TDS. There's not enough blanks. Very bad practice. We require agents to fill out an AVID and attach it to the TDS. You check the box and it becomes part of the transfer disclosure statement. And once that is complete and delivered, then the 5 days starts counting.
Both agents AVID?
No, that's a great question, by the way. I think, Del, was that you?
Yes.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, Civil Code does not allow the buyer's agent to fool around and give the buyer an unlimited contingency window, because imagine if the buyer's agent's AVID was required as part of it, then the buyer's agent would simply not do a visual inspection until a day before escrow closes, then do it, and then say, oh, nope, TDS was never discovered. So it's kind of an interesting thing because agents get a little confused by it. On one hand, the law says a buyer's agent must do one, but on the other hand, it is not part of the rescission right of the TDS, only the listing agent. And it makes perfect sense. I think that's one of the reasons I like the law, because usually the law, figures all this stuff out and makes pretty good sense. The legislature sometimes screws up things, but when you dig into the law, you discover, okay, they've got it figured out. So the buyer's agent must do an agent visual inspection, but the buyer can't claim he didn't get a TDS completed without one because his own agent didn't do one. He won't succeed in that claim. Great question, Del. Okay, the next statutory disclosure is a natural hazard disclosure, and I put down zone report. A lot of misunderstanding about that. There is no real property sale exempt from providing zone reports. That's the third-party natural hazard disclosures that different companies do. Some of them 30, 40, 50 pages long. The first page or two is the summary that checks what zones the property is in, and that by statutory disclosure, disclosure is required for all real property. The TDS is, of course, not required for land or for more than 4 units for commercial property. The lead-based paint disclosure is not required for properties built after 1978. So there are certain exemptions from providing these disclosures, so that keep that in mind. There is no real property sale exemption for the natural hazard disclosure zone report. Took the banks about 6 months during 2008, maybe 2009, when the foreclosures were at their peak. By then, when they're at their peak, by then the banks finally figured out, oh yeah, in California, we have to provide that, So they started doing that. Initially, they thought they were exempt from that, but they're not. Okay. And then finally, the HHDA, the new form. Haven't done a class on this. I need to do maybe a 15-minute quickie everybody can look at sometime, not wait until another risk reduction. The Home Fire Hardening Disclosure Advisory, that's that new form that was memorialized by Civil Code effective January 1 of this year for properties, again, 1 to 4 residential units, not land, not commercial property, but 1 to 4 residential units, which includes condos. If they are in a high or very high fire zone, then the HHDA must be delivered. And, the problem is a lot of times agents don't know because the natural hazard people, they don't distinguish between a moderate fire zone and a high fire zone. They lump them together and call it a wildfire zone. In some cases, the wildfire zone is a moderate, some cases it's a high. They do have a distinct box because Civil Code dictates it for a very high. So the recommendation is, and I've already advised our office, I think I shared this with All Pro as well. You should make the HHDA part of every transaction. Treat it like a transfer disclosure statement. Give it early, because then there's no downside. If you're in a no fire zone, there's no downside to providing the disclosure. There is a downside to providing it late when you're required to provide it, because just like as Kenny was mentioning and I mentioned, if you don't do the AVI memorialized by an AVID with the transfer disclosure statement, then the delivery hasn't happened yet. If you don't do a home fire hardening disclosure and advisory until the end of the transaction, and such a form is required, you've opened up a window for the buyer to cancel and get their deposit back, even if they've removed contingencies. Okay, so those are the statutory disclosures. And so how do you deal with those? Well, if the required statutory disclosures are delivered to the buyer before the buyer writes the offer, writes is the key word, before and writes, not delivered before the offer is accepted. So the buyer sends over an offer and then you say, oh, this is going to be a non-contingent offer. Before we accept it, we're going to send over all our disclosures. Too late. If a buyer is going to write a non-contingent offer and you've already received the offer and you want to move forward with that, you have not satisfied the delivery of the statutory disclosures prior to writing the offer, and the delivery gives the buyer 5-day right of rescission. There is no right of rescission for these disclosures unless these disclosures are amended or revised by the seller if they are delivered before the buyer writes their offer. So if you are aware of the fact that a buyer is going to write a non-contingent offer, then before they write the offer, be sure they get, first of all of the statutory disclosures, and then keep this in mind. There are lots of contractual rights of rescissions in the RPA for all disclosures. So unless these disclosures are also delivered before the buyer writes the offer, they would still have their right of rescission. So the RPA gives that 5-day right of rescission to all of the disclosures. Civil Code doesn't necessarily do that. So rule of thumb, if you are going to have a non-contingent offer, all disclosures must be provided prior to the buyer writing their offer. Hope that's clear to everyone.
Well, would that work Would that work if you put the disclosures in the MLS
Well, the
as
only
a
problem with
document
that-
attachment?
well, no, probably not. They probably only because how are you going to document delivery was made? You know, so you can put them in there and tell the buyer agent to please sign and return those disclosures with your offer. That would work. But if you just put them in there and then you say, nope, we delivered them, we put them on the MLS, that's not real delivery.
Got it.
So again, summarizing what I just said, if you want to do that, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, it's probably a good idea, include an instruction that these must be signed and returned with your offer, or your offer will not be considered as a non-contingent offer. Add that last little sentence too, because you have to, you'd want to consider the offer, but just not as non-contingent. Okay. Great question. Okay, escalation clauses. The escalation clause is probably one of the most misunderstood, poorly written clauses. I've seen all kinds of horrible clauses, and I've studied this a bit. I do not advocate this. I've known about escalation clauses for 20 years. I've resisted putting it on Agent Hub or anything like that because I don't want to encourage the use. I'm sort of coming around to the fact that, boy, in this market, buyers want to do it and sellers are, responding to buyers who want to do it. So I think I'm obligated, not only in this class, but like I said, I'm going to provide these clauses to Lindsay so that if you're going to do an escalation clause, at least you write it correctly, because there are a lot of bad escalation clauses out there. And I'll touch on a few things, a few horror stories about because the escalation clause wasn't written well, what resulted. So I've provided even a shorter version of this 8-clause addendum to some of the agents, and I've gotten feedback from their co-op agents telling them, wow, that's a pretty thorough escalation clause. One agent told me his co-op agent told him, I'm going to steal this and use it on my offer. So, I've tuned it up even a little more because I want to make sure that if you're going to use these clauses, this escalation clause, I give you the maximum protection possible. Okay, so the escalation clause addendum. So it's an 8-part addendum, 8 paragraphs on the addendum. So paragraph 1 is the purchase price stated in 1C, that's the purchase price on the RPA up on top of this purchase agreement shall be further modified by provision contained in this escalation clause. It's important that a purchase price be established. You do not have a contract if no purchase price, a specific purchase price is not established. So the first mistake some people make is they simply do an escalation clause. We'll beat any other offer you get by 10,000. You don't have a contract. Why? Because you didn't say what your offer is. See, so you have to state your price to start with. So you're buying a house for $600,000. It's worth $575,000, but you've been told that other offers are coming in, and you want to get this house, and you'll go up. So you put down. I threw those numbers out, and I forgot what they were. You put down $600,000. That's your base price. So, but then in the escalation clause addendum, by the way, you check an RPA, you check addendum number, whatever, probably addendum number 1 as part of your purchase agreement, and the escalation clause addendum. And then you include the addendum with all of these paragraphs on the addendum. So the purchase price, which is stated in 1C, is further modified by the provisions within this escalation clause addendum. Number 2. This is the escalation factor. In the event the seller receives another offer to purchase the property with terms acceptable to the seller, competing offer, but which results in net proceeds of a sale payable to the seller equal to or greater than the net proceeds of the sale payable to the seller under this offer, the one you're writing, then the purchase price stated in this offer shall automatically be increased to an amount which generates net proceeds of sale to seller equal to, and this is what you're willing to beat any other offer by. But it's written this way because you're just not beating any offer by, say, $5,000. What if the other offer has a $10,000 provision of paying the buyer's closing costs? Well, then you're already $5,000 above theirs. But your offer is already better because you're not having the seller pay your closing costs. So this net proceeds language is very important. And you establish the escalation factor, and that's the amount you will beat any other offer by, but that offer must generate net proceeds that are higher than yours, and you will add to your offer to increase the seller's net proceeds by that dollar amount. Could be 5,000, could be 10,000. 10,000 is a pretty hefty number, frankly, because it's net proceeds. All right, so that, word for word, you want that clause. And we're going to discuss how you've determined net proceeds as a part of this clause. Competing offer. Now, this is important. I'll beat any other offer. A verbal offer, an offer from my mother, an offer from the agent in my office who's writing me a bogus offer so I can bump your price up. See, you got to be very specific, because if anybody can fool around with this, this is an easy thing to fool around with, this escalation clause and the final agreed purchase price. If somebody were a little bit unscrupulous, I'm not suggesting anybody is, certainly not everybody, but just in case, this will protect your client. So what is a competing offer? It's a bona fide arm's length, not an offer from your relative, not an offer from your listing agent, written on a car form, containing all the material terms necessary for an inversal agreement, which one does not include seller financing. All right, I'll pay you $100,000 more than you listed, but you carry back $100,000, and then 6 months from now we'll write off the note. I mean, that's what those kinds of things happen. So the bona fide offer cannot include seller financing because it's too easy to manipulate the price your buyer would pay if you don't say that. It also must provide a closing not later than 60 days after the offer date. Yeah, we'll pay $50,000 more, but we'll buy it 2 years from now. Well, if you don't make that clear, well, yeah, you will, but I'm buying it now. I got to beat 50,000 by another 10,000? I don't think so. And not contingent upon the competing offer's buyer property entering escrow. It can be contingent on closing escrow, but the buyer's property's got to be in escrow, because otherwise, how do you know it's really a bona fide offer if the buyer's property that he has to sell, the other competing offer's buyer's property that he has to sell, is listed for $100,000 more than it's worth? In this market, he might get lucky, but that's still pretty unusual. So you want to remove that as a factor as well. Okay. Pretty straightforward. Net proceeds. So how do you define net proceeds? Net proceeds of the sale shall be the net amount payable to the seller upon closing after any and all price adjustments, credits, concessions, and other seller paid costs and expenses are deducted from the purchase price. So that, levels the playing field. Your offer doesn't include any kickback or any, kickback's a bad word, any paying of buyer's closing costs or anything like that. But the other competing offer, which beat yours on the bottom line, on the offer price, but had a pay closing costs or something like that for the second buyer, as I discussed before, it's really not an apples to apples comparison. So that needs to be a part of the addendum as well. The cap. The purchase price triggered by this escalation clause addendum shall not exceed, and that's the most the buyer will pay. Now, here is a very interesting, I can't think of the word now, but a dilemma, if you will, for the buyer's agent. Keep this in mind. If you are a buyer's agent and your buyer wants to include an escalation clause, you should advise the buyer of this. Think about this. If you say, I'll beat any other, you offered 600, I'll beat any other offer by $5,000, not to exceed 650. So you put 650 here, that's your cap. Now that's your offer. That's not the contract. Seller hasn't agreed. So the seller simply counters back. Sale price shall be 650, period. Because now the seller knows what your maximum price is. And the seller removes any need to get an offer at 645. Think through that a moment. The one big disadvantage of providing an escalation clause addendum with your offer is you've got to name a cap. Otherwise, where does it stop? And when you do, a very savvy listing agent and seller could very likely decide to simply counter you back without the escalation clause, but simply that maximum cap you would go to. So that's something you got to discuss with the buyer, and that's a problem you may have to deal with if you're in that situation. Documentation. In the event the competing offer causes the escalation of the purchase price in this offer, seller shall provide the buyer with sufficient documentation, including a copy of the competing offer, to justify the purchase price increase triggered by this escalation clause. There's a misconception among most agents, and that is that offers are confidential. They are not. A seller can take your offer and publish it on the front page of the newspaper, post it in Facebook or whatever else, unless there's a confidentiality agreement signed, which is rare in residential real estate. It's pretty common in commercial real estate. Building owners don't want, the owner of this building, if he were going to sell this building, he may not want all the tenants to know he's selling the building. And so he'll have a confidentiality agreement as a part of any offer or counter offer, so that you don't have problems with your commercial tenants. And so that's pretty common in commercial real estate, doesn't exist in residential. There is a confidentiality agreement in CAR that can be included in a residential purchase contract, but that would have to be waived or not included in an escalation clause addendum in order for you to be able to document what the price paid on that competing offer. Number 7. Documenting the increase of purchase price. In the event that purchase price is increased pursuant to the escalating clause, an increased purchase price shall be stated in a counter offer generated by the seller. Upon acceptance of the counter offer by the buyer, the agreed to initial purchase price shall be established. It's very important. Number 7 is very important. You got to establish how the price is established after the escalation clause is kicked in and a price gets established. All right, now that seems like, well, yeah, of course. What does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. It allows for number 8 to have some teeth. The terms contained herein are solely for the use and purpose of determining a mutually agreed to initial purchase price, and shall be deemed satisfied and shall terminate upon ratification of the initial purchase price and contract for sale of the property. Why is this important? Imagine if you didn't have this. You're in escrow for 3 weeks. You're a week away from funding the loan. Here comes another offer as a backup offer, and it's $20,000 higher than the offer you thought you were going to close with. Absent a termination of the addendum, the escalation addendum, a savvy attorney would argue, hey, you got to bump that price. We just got a bona fide arm's length offer, legitimate offer, and it's beaten the offer that we're in escrow with now. So what this termination clearly states is we're done with the escalation clause once the initial purchase price has been ratified. Any questions there? All right, so that's the entire escalation clause addendum, all 8 clauses. I'll put that together and we'll post it. Again, you want to be very careful using this to advise the buyer about what the risks are and whether or not they really want to do this. I will tell you, as a listing agent, you should advise the seller that most escalation clauses fail ultimately. Most, just like options to purchase, most of those ultimately fail. So that's something to be aware of. All right, advisories to the buyer.
Walt,
Yes.
got a quick question.
Yes.
This has come up, people have asked this question before. Using this escalation clause to get the property under contract.
Yes.
And then during the course of the escrow, 2.5 weeks in, the buyer does an inspection. It's got a torn screen and a broken window, and they ask for a $30,000 price reduction to offset the request for repairs.
Right.
And the attitude being that the buyer's agent now has the property under contract, the seller's 2.5 weeks into the deal. Do they want to unwind the deal now because the buyer's agent and the buyer use the escalation clause to get it under contract and then try to manipulate it by using requests for repairs and other issues?
Yeah, that's a risk you take. That's a great point, Larry. That's why these escalation clauses, like I just said, anecdotally, they fail more often than they don't.
Exactly.
You think, okay, I got a great price because I had an escalation clause on that. My buyer, the buyer who, I'm the seller. So the buyer had an escalation clause and look what I did. Yeah, but then they're going to bail on their other contingencies. So the best counter to that is relatively short contingency windows and being very strict about removing contingencies so that window of doubt is not open, for 3-4 weeks. It wraps up within 2 weeks or so. So have, I've seen escalation clauses well done where they have, I don't like 10-day contingency periods. If you're going to have a 10-day contingency period as the buyer, you should require the seller to give you all disclosures within 3 days. Not 7 days, because if you don't change that, then you get all the disclosures. Now you have 3 days after getting them. That doesn't seem very smart. So great point, though, Larry. That's exactly the issue with escalation clauses. They're not necessarily, all they appear to be. Okay, advisories to the buyer. So the buyer should be advised about the risks of paying over list price, removing or reducing the appraisal contingency with the offer, removing the loan contingency with the offer, and removing investigation contingencies with the offer. Now, here's what's kind of nice. The MCA, the Market Conditions Advisory, does a very good job of making these advisories to the buyer. My only concern would be, and that's why I'm addressing it now, that buyer's agents sort of brush that off. And I would argue that you should review the MCA with the buyer, paying particular attention to the appropriate advisory clause that they are dealing with. Maybe they're removing, removing their appraisal contingency. Well, the MCA discusses it. It's a 2-page form. And for example, the offering price, there's a very nice paragraph, 2 paragraphs actually, discussing the risks of offering, paying a price that you're not comfortable with and that you may be overpaying. The market's hot now, but what happens if it cools off and suddenly you have zero equity? You paid $100,000 more than what the comps are, and the market's cooling off. You may have a while before you make that equity up in appreciation. So, I was going to write up a couple of advisories, but I can't do a better job than Carr. Carr did an excellent job discussing offering price. Carr did an excellent job discussing appraisal contingency. So if a buyer is going to fool around with the standard boilerplate appraisal contingency in the RPA, be sure you review with the buyer the MCA, paying attention to paragraph B and B2. Same with the loan contingency, B and B1. And likewise, the non-contingent offers which is B on page 1, and then 3, inspection contingency on page 2 of the MCA. So review these. You should take a moment and review the MCA if you're getting involved in any of these sort of exotic offer approaches. Be sure you're familiar with the MCA. Make sure you review it with your buyer. And for heaven's sakes, make sure the buyer executes the MCA, memorializing that you reviewed it. And you might even memorialize by written document that you have reviewed the MCA with the buyer and they've elected to proceed. And then finally, the MCA, there's a broker recommendation that you do not write non-contingent offers and that you do seek the professional advice if you're considering anything like that. So excellent way to very simply memorialize an advisory to the buyer. Folks, that completes the presentation. I'm right at the hour, actually a couple of minutes over. Does anybody have any questions as we wrap things up?
I have one question.
Yes.
Back to the FHA-VA, a mandatory clause.
Uh-huh.
So I have a transaction where the seller accepted, I represent the seller, accepted a VA offer.
Uh-huh.
We've just gone through the Tidewater. It did not appraise.
Yeah.
The buyer is supposed to remove all contingencies today and bring in the difference. Can they cancel even up until the minute right before they fund and get their deposit back?
Yes. Short answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the mandatory, notwithstanding any other provision, precedent or antecedent, that's before or after.
So even if they remove all contingencies and they change their mind at the last minute, they get their deposit back.
If it didn't appraise. Right. Now, if it appraised, but they changed their mind because now they don't like the fact that the windows are all fogged, well, too bad.
Right.
The mandatory clause doesn't affect any other contingency other than the appraisal. And it simply says that if you can't get a certificate of value, in other words, an appraisal, a written certificate of value at the purchase price, the buyer cannot be forced to forfeit their deposit.
Even if they agree to bring in the difference.
Notwithstanding any other provision.
Okay, up until they close, they can cancel.
Right.
Okay.
Up until it's closed, they can.
Well,
it didn't appraise. Yes.
Well, this is Andrea Castaneda. On that same thought, if you, so it doesn't matter if you counter it out because it supersedes, doesn't matter. If you had referenced that you don't know of any law that would require the seller to sign it, can't we just counter out that clause in its entirety? And then the lender's going to want them to sign something at the close of escrow, but that's at the bottom of the ninth where we won't have as much liability to the seller when we're already at the funding table.
Even if they sign it at the close of escrow, even if you think, okay, we'll remove all contingencies, we won't sign the mandatory clause until an hour before escrow closes, notwithstanding any other provision. Now, if the buyer's going to buy it anyway and make up the difference in cash, I would argue that's probably your case. If you're an hour away from closing, it's probably already made up the difference. But if he changed his mind, even if his money was in escrow, if you do not have a certificate of value, notwithstanding any other provision. Now, the problem with countering it out early on is you're really kind of, preventing the buyer then from getting his loan. Lenders are supposed to, this is their guidance, not submit the loan to underwriting until an amendatory clause is signed. So normally that comes up right away. I can tell you lots of lenders, they know the agent, they think they know the buyer, they're not worried about it. Then they call the seller up at the 11th hour to get it. And if there's a problem, the lenders can't submit the loan and the buyer can't now get his loan. And that could be problematic. So the boilerplate in the contract makes the seller obligated to sign it. It's not optional if you use an RPA.
Okay.
Well, really quick, this only holds true on FHA and VA offers. in the beginning, if you have multiple offers, given the environment that we're in right now, can you write in the counter offer that the buyer, if the appraisal doesn't come in at value, they would have to obtain conventional financing and check with the lender and see if that's an option? Because I mean, it seems like we're not doing a good job representing our sellers with 20 offers or 10 offers, and then it almost doesn't even make sense to go with an FHA or VA offer if they're above list price. But we also want to give the FHA buyers and, of course, our veterans a chance at getting houses, right? Because it's just stacking the odds against them in today's environment of even getting a house, which it's already stacked so far against them in the beginning. So it'd be nice as listing agents to give them the opportunity, but not put our sellers in a position where it can be canceled at the end with no skin in the game and no recourse to the buyer. And then the seller has to start over after 30 days, after maybe they've purchased another property. I mean, I feel like it needs to be fair to everyone. And this happens a lot when attorneys write CAR, because the way they write it and the way that it really works in the real world. So my question is just trying to think out of the box. While we want to give our FHA and VA buyers a legitimate chance of buying, but to also make it fair to the sellers, could we counter out, I guess I'll come up with some verbiage real quick, like seller hereby acknowledges that the buyer is obtaining FHA financing. If the appraisal comes in below appraised value, buyer to switch to conventional financing or something like. I mean, you give me the verbiage, but hopefully that'll make sense. Is that even a possibility, I guess?
Yeah, no, that's pretty creative. I think it's very much a possibility, and I'll work on language. I made a note. You could require the buyer to abandon the FHA VA loan and pursue a conventional loan in the event it doesn't appraise. And you're only at risk until they, cancel the VA. You cancel it in your purchase contract, whether they cancel with their lender or not, that doesn't matter. You just cancel it within your purchase contract. Now the mandatory clause does, I would argue, go away. So I'll look at that and see if I can't put something together, because I agree with you. Even as I was preparing this, the thought occurred to me, I'm going to teach the agents about the importance of understanding the mandatory clause, and the downside is going to be, okay, I'm not selling to any VA or FHA buyers, and that's not fair either. So like Kenny says, you give them an opportunity to buy. If they don't, if it doesn't appraise, they can still, you can still buy this house. You tried FHA or you tried VA, it didn't work. You can still buy it, but you got to go conventional. The other thing too, I would argue, is usually buyers, they want to buy the house as a rule. And if unless you have a lot of problems in the escrow, that doesn't change much. So one of the ways, it won't guarantee you don't have a problem, but one of the ways you sort of head off a problem, or at least be aware we're going to have a problem, is you confirm in the verification of funds the buyer has funds to make it up, because a buyer is going to say, oh no, I'll make up the difference. If the mandatory clause says they don't have to, they can still bail. If they don't have the funds, they don't have the option to do it. We had a transaction, actually, Kenny, with Allpro, where the VA buyer didn't have the funds, but they had represented they were going to pay more, but they didn't have it. They couldn't pay more. And had the funds been verified, we might have saw that and, preemptive strike. No, we're not going to, you don't have enough funds to pay over this. And so we're not going to, accept your offer. Because the offer is, you can make the offer contingent upon verification of sufficient funds to make.
Right. And most of the VA buyers are doing VA no-no. So they don't have the money.
Yeah. Well, some buyers I've seen some VA offers where they're, putting 50% down, and they're
yes,
still
I have too.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I would say there's
some. I should say some.
Yeah.
This
Kenny,
buyer
I mean,
has the
idea,
funds.
and we'll put something together.
That's a good idea, Kenny. That's a great idea to switch lenders and do something, because I'm seeing so many listings that have no VA financing, and it really is a shame. So that's a really good point.
It is. I agree.
Well, and
totally.
you don't have to necessarily, you can switch lenders or you can switch loan programs, right, with the same lender. And there's a couple other things that I've been noticing. We need to make sure that we're pushing this transaction down the road quickly as listing agents, because not getting the prelim up front, they can't submit, at least for FHA offers, I'm pretty sure, and I think VA as well, the complete loan package without the amendatory clause, but then they also need a copy of the prelim. So sometimes they're taking a week or 10 days. Well, okay, well, you have a 17-day, you can't even submit the loan, and you're 10 or 11 days in. So when you're taking a listing, some agents do it, some agents do not. But as soon as you get that listing, you should order the prelim straight away so that you have that in the file. And also making sure that as soon as you get a fully executed contract, that you're opening up escrow. It's important that we maybe don't even rely on the other agent to get it over to the lender, because hopefully you have the lender's information. You've done some cross qualification and made sure that they are proof of funds. You've spoke to the lender and you've done some due diligence in the beginning. It's really hectic for listing agents right now because we're getting multiple offers. And then as we're going through them and doing our due diligence, more offers are coming in. So it becomes, there's a lot thrown at us. But to slow down, make sure that you're digesting the information, that you're checking proof of funds, that you're checking their ability to go alternate financing if necessary. If you're going above list price, common sense, even though it's mistakes are made commonly, is that they need to have the liquid cash to be able to bridge the difference. Because what's it matter if I write an offer and I want to pay 20 grand over list price, but I only have 17 grand more than my closing costs and my down payment? It won't matter because I don't have enough funds to bridge the gap. So there's a lot of pieces that need to be put together, but you'll save yourself so much heartache if you do it prior to the acceptance. So sometimes with the sellers, like you need to slow them down and make sure that you're checking. I mean, I've had where, and it's an honest mistake, but it's mainly just paying attention, is where an agent had so many offers, they sent a purchase agreement, but then they sent the counter with another buyer, which seems like that's pretty ignorant, but it is an honest mistake, because with how many pieces of paper and offers do you have when you have 23 offers, right? There's a lot of moving parts. And I know we like to go fast and we like to get things done, but that is our job and our neck on the line when we're going through these offers and doing our due diligence. This is why these sellers are picking us versus other listing agents, other companies, is because it's all in the details. And so making sure that we have the prelim and we have all our disclosures done, those need to get sent immediately, and keeping the pressure on the appraisal to make sure that it's either one, ordered on a rush. In rural areas, sometimes the appraisers are so busy, they don't even want to go out there. So I've had agents where either the lender or the agents paid an extra $250 to incentivize the appraiser to get it done, right? So all these little competitive advantages you need to know about, because that's what the sellers are paying you to do. If not, go pick one of these other 1.4 million agents that are in the US that do not a lot of transactions, right? So they're paying you for this top level experience and advice. And this is what's going to set you apart in the marketplace. And not only doing a good job for this transaction, but that transaction, by having a great experience, they're going to tell 3 to 5 of their friends as well. And that's how you really build a great business, is making sure that you're on top of this stuff and you're the bulldog. This is your transaction and you're controlling it on behalf of the sellers, but we're not sitting back passively waiting or getting duped by some of these other agents that, like Larry said, where they're riding above list price and then they come back to us and want to negotiate afterwards. It's okay to blow people out of the water and hold them to the fire on the 17th day. And your sellers will appreciate that. And that's part of the listing presentation as well, is making sure that you're articulating, like, these are the pitfalls. This is what is happening in the marketplace. This is how I'm going to protect you once we get an offer. My job's just only starting, because now we got to get from day 1 to day 17 when the contingencies are removed. And that's where my expertise is going to come in. Okay. So I think this all ties together, because you have to, it's a crazy market out there, and there's people trying to take advantage on both sides, and we see it every day. And Walt and I and Mary and Larry, we all are negotiating and playing tug of war and arm wrestling matches over each one of these transactions, because it's such a dog eat dog environment out there right now. So I seen, just to lighten it up a little bit, I seen a meme this morning. It says, "What do you do if your wife doesn't like the house?" And so it said, "Just find yourself a new wife, because it's easier to find a spouse than it is a home right now." So it's like, I was like, that's a pretty good one. I don't highly recommend it, but there could be some truth to that. So thank you all for joining. It was a great class. I love the risk reduction stuff, because I mean, the sharpening your skill sets is what sets you apart. So thank you, Walt, for your class. It was awesome. Thank you. And everyone attending. We got a bunch of people on here, 40 people. So this stuff is great information, and what makes us the best agents in the marketplace. So I will open it up. If you guys have any more questions, the floor is yours, and we're here to answer them.
Thank you for a great class, Walt.
You're welcome.
Hey, well, one thing I wanted to suggest is what I'm doing right now with the VA buyer, if it works for anybody. We've had 12 offers out and obviously got nothing. So my lender is going to transfer them to an FHA with down payment assistance, so that the money they were going to use for their closing costs will be able to use to meet the gap, bridge the gap from appraisal to purchase price, because they're going to use the down payment assistance money to pay their closing costs instead. So we're going to try it that way, see if we have any luck, but it's an option.
Yeah, in this market, it's important to affiliate with a good lender who is creative and can help position your buyer to be more competitive. I just want to piggyback on something Kenny said, because I cannot, I couldn't stress it enough. Right from Kenny's own mouth, the one of the top 5 things that buyers and sellers evaluate their agents by is, one of them is how smooth was the transaction. Buyers and sellers do not like turbulence that sometimes it seems like agents feed on, but the buyers and sellers don't like that. They don't like surprises. They like a smooth transaction. And Kenny hit on one of the essentials to a smooth transaction, and that is when you take a listing, order the prelim, and I would add one thing to that. Click on every single link in that prelim. Now, some of those links will be copies of the trust deed, and you don't care about that. It's going to be paid off. But you'll find things like private maintenance, road maintenance agreements. You'll find solar panels that the seller, we had a deal just recently. The seller insisted they own they own the panels. They do not. They're on a power production purchase contract. That was from the PR. Now, when you find this out 3 weeks into escrow, you're making a big mistake. And Kenny's right. The lenders are getting kind of sloppy as well. I've had more than one lender not look at a PR until 2 or 3 weeks into a transaction. So one of the ways to get the PR to the lender is insist your escrow officer give it to the lender right at the get-go. You know, you order it early, it should be easy to get. Now, if you order it early and a month goes by, be sure you check with the lender for an updated PR, but you're going to get most of what you need. And then the other two things, prelim, order it early, verify funds, you know, make sure the buyer's got the funds they need for this transaction to work. And, you know, that'll uncover things like COP offers that aren't COP offers. I need to sell my house, but I'm not going to tell you that because you won't take my offer. And I don't have the money to buy your house unless I sell my house. Well, that'll come up when you verify funds. That happens a lot. And then finally, seems like a simple thing, but as a buyer's agent, encourage your buyer to treat their insurance application like their loan application. You do it at the beginning of the transaction, not the end, because then when things come up on the clue report that the insurance company is going to run, you have plenty of time to deal with it, and you're not running around 3 days before close of escrow to deal with an undisclosed insurance claim, because give the seller the benefit of the doubt. They forgot about it. They didn't realize it was 4.5 years ago. You know, so they were supposed to disclose it. They didn't know. So some great tips there.
Yeah. And another pro tip is I never accept an offer without having a physical conversation with the lender, because it tells me what their communication's like. If they're not going to call me back in the beginning, I don't want to be with them for 30 days. And at least in this market, you know, when the market changes and you don't have multiple offers, you deal with certain stuff that you don't have to in today's environment. But it's very important to have a conversation, ask the difficult questions that may concern you or your sellers from the lender. So that's a great pro tip to make sure, do not accept any offers, financed offers, without speaking with the lender. And that'll save you a lot of time as well. And then as far as like any, when you're working with buyers, like Walt said, having a great lender, you know, and we have Jeanette at Mountain West. She can do loans anywhere in Southern California, the state of California. You know, what she does is she actually, with all the transactions, is when you submit an offer, because she kind of knows when you start asking for a pre-approval letter to submit an offer, and she follows up. When you submit that offer, she makes a personal phone call to the agent and say, hey, do you have any questions? I'm doing the loan, the overview of the loan and the program and the qualification. And what happens with that, it kind of it sets the stage, and it's a very good inflection to the listing agent for that competitive advantage. And we've had several offers be accepted when maybe we weren't the highest and maybe we weren't the most qualified buyer, but they knew that because of that outreach from Jeanette, that they were confident that it was going to close. So that's another pro tip. Whether you use Jeanette at Mountain West or any other lender, that's a good tip to helping when you're on the buying side as well.
I've dealt with Jeanette a couple of times in helping all pro agents, and I got to tell you, she's one phenomenal lady. Yeah. She has gone above and beyond to solve problems that had little to do with the loan, but because of her knowledge of the loan and the situation, she gave us solutions to problems that wouldn't have been as easily obtained. I'm very impressed with that lady. So all pro agents, you have a head of lettuce if you're not giving her an opportunity to earn her business.
Hey, Walt. Walt, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I know you're not going to go into this in detail, but those home hardening disclosures that are out now,
yep.
I've learned a couple of things just from what I'm doing, but in Oceanside, we have a listing. So now I'm ordering the NHD report like right away. And how we used to always look at the first 2 pages, all the little checkbox, I'm learning that sometimes they're stuck way in the report. It could say that it's not in the beginning, but it could be midway in the report. So I had one where I looked in Oceanside, it said, no, I couldn't find. So the transaction coordinator on that side still wants the signed home hardening. And she said to mark box 3 I guess I don't have one in front of me, but there's a box that says that whatever.
Not in the zone. It says, yeah, there's a box and it says it's not in a fire zone,
Correct.
but the seller makes this disclosure because, it could be affected by wildfires nonetheless. Yeah.
So is it okay for us to get them to check box 3?
Right.
Okay.
Now, my only concern about that is you want to be, I'm not sure. I'd want to be certain, ideally, that it's not in a fire zone.
Right.
Before I check box 3, because, if it's in a fire zone, but the seller says, no, it's not, that could be a little bit problematic. I think you could probably argue out of that in the end because the natural hazard zone report's going to trump anything the seller says. But yeah, you can just provide it. Cars actually said if you leave that box unchecked and just provide it, that's okay as well.
Okay.
Yeah, just as an advisory, because it has some information about wildfires.
So in this competitive market, when there's multiple offers on a lot of properties, let's say a conventional buyer removes his appraisal contingency to make his offer stronger. Mm-hmm. And then when the appraisal comes, it's way, way low and he wants to cancel. So is he pretty much stuck in trying to cancel with an appraisal contingency because he's already removed it, or she?
Well, let me differentiate, first of all, between canceling and losing a deposit. You can always cancel a purchase contract, but if you've initial liquidated damages, then you've limited your damage to the deposit in general. That's not universally true, but in general, that's true. But if you don't want to give up your deposit as well, I would never argue to act in bad faith. But if there are other issues with the property that you in good faith can claim as as a reason not to move forward, even though it doesn't appraise, if you still have your physical investigation contingencies, and you can in good faith say, you know what, I'm not too wild about the traffic, or I'm not too wild about the neighborhood, or I went to, agents should never do this, but buyers should go to Megan's website there and see where the sexual predators live. So you look at that and you don't like that. So you can make other claims. That's why on a cancellation, you don't say the specific reason, you cite the clause in the contract that allows you to make a cancellation. That will not be challenged, and the courts won't challenge that either. That's a subjective decision on your part. So one person may not be bothered by the traffic noise, another person very upset by it. So courts are not going to enforce that. So you can pick another reason to cancel if you have those, I'm not going to advocate acting in bad faith, but if you in good faith can say, I also don't like the traffic noise. In addition to it didn't appraise, you can probably get out. But if you removed all your contingencies and it didn't appraise, you got a problem. Your deposit's at risk.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I feel like it's safe to say that in today's environment, but probably in generality, that the purchase agreement or the real estate transaction is very protective to the buyer. It seems like you can almost unwind anything, and it's very hard to keep a deposit. It's almost easier to just part ways, give them their deposit back and relist the property. So you get down like a rabbit hole of not being able to cancel that escrow and open up a new one. So it's like it's very difficult to keep a buyer's deposit anymore, it seems like.
It is. I mean, if you think about it, the offer has only one seller contingency in the boilerplate, and that has to do with solar leases, solar panels. There are probably a couple of hundred buyer contingencies if you break them out. Look at the buyer's inspection, the BIA. I mean, it just lists contingency after contingency after contingency as a part of the investigative contingency. Item after item after item. So yeah, the buyer's well protected. The seller, you don't have as many outs. And Kenny's right, keeping a deposit is pretty difficult in general. I mean, if it's clearly a default by the buyer, you might that the courts are going to go out of their way to figure out a way to give the buyer back their deposit. That's the way the law works. Well, folks, thanks for joining me. I enjoyed the day. I hope you learned something, and I'm looking forward to next month. If you have any questions, and if you have any suggestions about topics that you'd like to have us cover, by all means, shoot me an email, shoot Kenny an email. He and I talk about this. We want to cover as much as we can by these classes going forward.